Kofi married Aminata 3 years ago, but to be honest, he wouldn't have married her if she hadn't become the sole owner of the business after her father's sudden death. Her father, Mr. Diop, a seemingly young and strong businessman, had died unexpectedly from a stroke. Aminata was Mr. Diop's only child and she was the sole heir to his fortune. That is why Kofi, a handsome slacker who was used to living at the expense of women, paid attention to her. Aminata was captivated by Kofi's charming promises while he planned to stay with her until a more profitable opportunity arose. But it soon turned out that the most favorable option, the jackpot of his life, was Aminata. She inherited her father's colossal wealth, and Kofi knew exactly how to take advantage of it. He believed he could easily manipulate her deeper affection for him to control her fortune, and everything was going as well as possible for Kofi. The girl was deeply grieving her father, who had been her pillar of support and the most significant person in her life, so Kofi quickly surrounded Aminata with care and support during such a hard time. The young and naive girl was unaware that the worst moment of her life had spurred Kofi to hide his true nature even more, at least until their wedding. He maintained his good behavior, ensuring there was no turning back. After the funeral, he proposed marriage, of course suggesting they wait until her mourning period for her father was over. Kofi was adept at deception, manipulation, and pretense. He could become whoever he needed to be and do whatever was expected of him. With his wealthy girlfriends, he typically didn't put in much effort, thinking there would always be another wealthy woman. But with Aminata, the gain was worth it. The efforts would not be in vain, and the cunning man clearly understood it. But the first hurdle for him came unexpectedly from a source he couldn't have foreseen. Aminata's father had a best friend, who was also his main deputy in the company and godfather to Aminata. Mr. Abiodun understood right away that Aminata was head over heels in love, and wouldn't be dissuaded from marriage. Her grief over losing her father made her seek a replacement, but as an intelligent and shrewd man, Mr. Abiodun categorically insisted on the prenuptial agreement, and he managed to win Aminata over to his side. "Kofi, it's for business. Is it that hard?" Aminata asked, repeating what Mr. Abiodun had told her. "This is humiliating. Do you think I need your money?" The man retorted, indignant at this turn of events. "Honey, it's just a formality. We only need it in case of divorce. My godfather really wants us to sign it. He's always been like a second father to me," Aminata explained. Aminata may have been naive about financial matters, given that she'd never had to worry about money, but she wasn't a fool in other respects. When she set a goal, she achieved it no matter what. Kofi was pinned against the wall and had to agree to all of Mr. Abiodun's terms. The marriage contract formulation was standard, but it curtailed Kofi's rights completely. It was evident that the business and all other property inherited from Aminata's father could not become joint property of the spouses. Kofi assumed he would receive a share in the dividends, acquire new property and assets. However, the contract, drafted by a top-class lawyer, prevented Kofi from having this opportunity. Despite this, Kofi believed the marriage was still beneficial to him, as he would access his wife's finances without control and build up capital for the future. He was going to take money from the common budget on a daily basis and transfer it to his name. But Kofi was mistaken in this regard too. Mr. Abiodun was a dedicated, decent, and responsible person who not only controlled Aminata's financial flows in business, but also her personal finances. Kofi had limited funds for personal expenses, but nevertheless, he remained optimistic about the future and waited to see how the situation would develop. And soon it turned out that his patience was indeed rewarded. Aminata had been trying to conceive since their wedding day. She desired motherhood, but each new cycle brought bitterness and disappointment. Initially, she attributed it to nerves and stress caused by the frantic pace of life. She took business into her own hands and learned a lot on the go, which was naturally exhausting. After more than a year of unsuccessful attempts, the woman sought help from specialists, underwent a full medical examination, and identified the cause of the failures. Aminata's symptoms, which she had attributed to a busy lifestyle, turned out to be alarm bells. Her body was warning her of problems, but she had ignored them, and finally, the doctors diagnosed her with cancer. She underwent almost 2 years of treatment and suffering, but with little success. All this time, Kofi played the role of husband only nominally. His vested interest was that Aminata simply did not exist, and he had not managed to hide it well enough. Although they never openly discussed it, Aminata was aware of the numerous women her husband had cheated on her with. But Kofi believed he was adept at conspiracy and manipulation. He believed he was successfully playing the role of a dying wife's husband without arousing suspicion. He felt lucky and thought he only needed to endure a little longer to achieve his desired outcome. However, Kofi's behavior was condemned and discussed by everyone, from the nurses in the hospitals where Aminata was treated to Mr. Abiarnun. The man was furious and helpless. He couldn't comprehend why Aminata would desperately want to preserve her marriage on the brink of the grave. He also was worried that Aminata had no will. As a result, her husband automatically became her only heir. That scoundrel inherits everything, including the fruits of Aminata and her father's hard work, and all would be for nothing, an exercise in futility. Mr. Abiodun was sure that Kofi, this weasel, would squander all the property within a few years. However, the elderly man was at a loss on how to broach such a delicate subject with his goddaughter, who until recently emanated health and youth, and now had no chance she was dying, and it would happen in the very near future, that the score was counting down to weeks. Kofi was already rubbing his greedy hands together, his eyes burning with anticipation of getting rid of his frowning and sick wife and acquiring a solid capital. It seemed to him that the matter was in the bag. Mr. Abiodun prayed that he would not have to start a conversation about the will himself, but fortunately it was not necessary. Aminata started the conversation herself. Her secret left him speechless because she had planned everything meticulously with finesse and ruthlessness he never expected. Revenge is truly a dish best served cold, and Aminata executed it flawlessly. The way Aminata came up with and realized did not take much effort and time, but completing her journey here on Earth, she realized her main dreams. Unfortunately, Aminata's loved ones did not witness a miracle, and she passed away without recovering. She had arranged the details of her funeral with great care before her death, serene and resolute. She clearly conveyed her final wishes. The day after the farewell ceremony, the notary called the people mentioned by Aminata and Aminata in her will, and asked them to arrive for its announcement. Kofi was shocked by such news. He was sure that his wife had not drawn up any official document in case of her death, and he would become her sole heir as the law usually provides in such cases. Still hoping for the best, he went to the appointed meeting, taking his new mistress, Zanel, who was a striking beauty. Upon entering the notary's office, Kofi spotted Mr. Abiodun and Aminata's friend Kwame Akoto, but what caught him off guard was that Kwame wasn't alone. He was pushing a stroller with a baby boy inside. Kofi was completely unaware of Kwame's marriage or the birth of the child, although Kofi wasn't an expert in any field. He certainly wasn't foolish, and it didn't take him long to realize there was a hidden agenda at play, and he had been outsmarted. Despite this, curiosity overwhelmed him. He wanted to know what Aminata had devised, even though it was already evident that it would be something incredibly humiliating for him. For approximately 15 minutes, everyone remained silent, occupying different corners of the room. No one else arrived. The notary seemed to have deliberately prolonged the introductory part as much as possible, telling them why they had gathered, what an honor it was to read the deceased's last will and testament. Even then, Kofi could tell by the wicked grin that remained on Mr. Abiodun's face that the contents of the will were a secret only to Kofi. Finally, Kofi heard his name. "To my lawful husband Kofi, I deny the inheritance," read the notary. After reading this modest and short sentence, the notary looked at Kofi and asked him if he had understood the essence of what he had said. The humiliated man had no choice but to nod. At that moment, Zanel took his hand and tried to get up to leave defiantly, but Kofi held her in place. She looked at him with a questioning look that the man ignored. He himself would have wanted to leave the scene of his public humiliation as quickly as possible, but the play was not over, and the invited audience needed to see it through to the end. After a brief pause, the notary proceeded, "I bequeath all my personal property to my only son, Jabari Akoto. Until he reaches adulthood, I appoint his father, Kwame Akoto, and Mr. Abiodun as guardians and administrators of his estate." A shocking revelation hit Kofi like a gut punch. What? A son from Kwame? His patience broke, and he burst out with a surprised scream. Other than Kofi and Zanel, the news didn't come as a surprise to anyone present. Is the boy Aminata's biological child? Kofi asked, gasping for breath and raising his voice. Yes, Jabari is the biological son of Aminata, and Kwame clarified Mr. Abiodun. She hasn't been pregnant in the last 2 years. That's impossible. Kofi desperately clutched at straws, despite realizing that nowadays being pregnant wasn't necessary to have a child. The godfather smirked, clearly relishing Kofi's shock and disappointment. The advancements in medicine these days are astounding, he remarked. Looking at this scene, Kwame remembered the horror he felt 2 years ago when he discovered that his best friend was seriously ill with little chance of recovery. It was shocking to him how calmly she spoke about her limited time and what she needed to do. That's when she revealed her desire to become a mother. No matter what, I had my eggs preserved before starting treatment. I was told that I probably wouldn't be able to raise my own child, but I insisted. Kwame grew up without a mother, and I know it isn't easy, but I always felt her love and protection, she said. Does Kofi agree to raise the child alone? Kwame cautiously inquired. Who would allow him? He would gladly become a guardian and use the baby's money. He lacks conscience. No, I've already realized that my dear spouse is someone of questionable character, to put it politely. And his reaction to my diagnosis and prognosis, I don't even want to speak about him. This man isn't worth getting upset about, she declared. And what about the baby? That's what I wanted to discuss with you. Aminata hesitated, which was quite unusual for her, as she was usually fearless. I don't know how to broach the subject delicately. Maybe there is no delicate way. In short, I would like you to be the father of my child, she exclaimed in a high-pitched voice. Are you joking? You have a husband? Kwame clearly wasn't prepared for this. Yes, I do have a husband, and I will have him until the day I die. I've already made that decision, Kwame. Of course we won't sleep together. It's impossible given my current condition. I can't carry the baby myself, unfortunately. I had my eggs preserved. Now we need the biological material from the future father. Naturally, I also need a woman to carry and give birth to him. But luckily, such services are available now, she explained. At first, Kwame thought it was absurd, the nonsensical ramblings of a desperate woman. Yet she had an entire logical plan in her head, and it turned out that she had already completed a significant amount of preparatory work, researched the legal aspects, arranged for reproductive clinic services, and even found a mother for the future baby. Kwame, I could use the services of a donor for the father, but I really want to leave a piece of myself behind. But when you think about it, who will the baby be with? I've been thinking a lot, and you're the only one I can rely on. I am sure of you. Knowing you for so many years, I believe that you will be a great father. I understand that you want to create your own family, get married, and have children naturally. It's logical, but please think about it. Don't answer me right now. After what happened with Kofi, it is critical to me that the father of my child is someone who doesn't prioritize money, someone who won't exploit my assets. I'm not as naive as I was before marriage. Kofi taught me a lot. Now I have a lot of life experience. As for you, you don't need any money at all, you have plenty, she said. My father has, the man replied, correcting Aminata's reasoning for the first time. You know you're going to get it. You worked tirelessly to keep the family company thriving. You've never been needy. Now I know for a fact that a man who grew up poor will never stop thinking about having enough to eat, and if his decency is also lacking, there will be a big problem. I have experienced that firsthand, the woman sadly added. To be honest, I'm completely confused. I had an entirely different idea of becoming a father. I need to consult my parents. Understand that I can't make such a decision alone. I will need the help of close family members when I become a father, so I have to inform them and ask for their opinion, Kwame admitted. Aminata had no objection, so she only requested that Kwame promise to keep it a secret. The conversation with Kwame's parents was very difficult. His father neutrally accepted everything that was said, listened to all the explanations, and assured him that he would support his son's decision and would help as much as he could with his grandchild. His mother, however, was not as open-minded. Like all mothers, she wanted him to marry a good woman and have children together. She felt immense sympathy for Aminata. She had known her from childhood and thought highly of her, but this request was very difficult for a mother to accept. Knowing that her potential grandchild's mother was dying and that the child would be carried by another woman. Can't the child get the disease? The woman dreaded this question, finding it awful, awkward, and out of place. However, how else could she ensure her grandson's safety? Aminata does not have a hereditary form of the disease, Kwame answered. This reassured the anxious woman to some extent, though not completely. Nevertheless, after careful consideration, she expressed her support for her son's decision. Kwame himself also struggled with indecision. Aminata's proposal caught him off guard, but after some period of contemplation, he concluded that there was no reason to refuse. When he conveyed his approval to Aminata, she was overjoyed, and they began implementing her plan step by step. While Kwame sat and reflected on the life-altering story, Mr. Abiodun reminisced about the conversation with Aminata a little over 2 months ago. Starting from afar, she said that she honored Mr. Abiodun as a second father and hoped he wouldn't refuse. Then she blurted out that she wanted him to become the guardian of her son. Initially, Mr. Abiodun thought his goddaughter was delirious, but as Aminata shared the full story, the godfather was left in shock. Not only had Aminata and Kwame made such a bold decision, but they had also hidden it for so long. "How old is the baby now?" Mr. Abiodun asked. "Jabari is 8 months old," Aminata smiled. "You both truly know how to surprise Mr. Abiodun exclaimed, still processing the shock. "I don't want Kofi to find out about the child before I die. In fact, he will only find out when my will is announced. I've already had it drafted, and it's held with the notary. However, there's one aspect that still needs to be resolved. Jabari will have only one parent. I've reassessed many aspects of my life, and I don't want to leave anything to chance. Kwame has parents, so if anything were to happen to him, Jabari will go to them. But I want you to have rights too." Just in case, she said. Being good at understanding people, the elderly man sensed that it could be too dangerous to act with Kofi like this, even though Aminata's husband fully deserved such treatment. "Aminata, are you sure this is the way to treat your husband? He's a repugnant man, involving oneself with his means. Why do you need such vengeance from beyond the grave?" He expressed his thoughts, then immediately stopped himself. "Sorry, dear, for being so rude. You know, I've pondered this for 2 years. I witnessed Jabari's birth, saw how Kwame loves him, and his parents adore him. I require nothing else. I have accepted the situation. Currently, I am much more annoyed by those who speak to me about some mystical recovery and healing. And as for Kofi, I loved him so deeply. I believed in him with all my heart, but he turned out to be the most ungrateful beast. He comes to my hospital as if it were hard labor. Do you know his girlfriends brought him here?" The elderly man silently nodded, bitterness apparent in his expression. "And I should forget this?" "Absolutely not. He cherishes money above all, so that's how I will punish him. It will be a surprise for him. You see, I kept everything from you. It was immensely difficult. I wanted to introduce you to my son right away, but I was exceedingly cautious so that no one would accidentally find out and tell Kofi. This may be my farewell to him. I even wrote him a letter. The notary will deliver it," Aminata concluded. Mr. Abiodun made several attempts to dissuade his goddaughter. It seemed to him like an ill-advised decision, yet the woman maintained her stance, and he had to concede. After all, it was her final will. And it deserved to be respected. Amidst the sudden silence in the notary's office, everyone was engrossed in their own thoughts. Of course, you don't need to be a fortune teller to guess that Kofi cursed Aminata in every possible manner. People like him have no inkling that they themselves might be to blame, and that others' behavior could be a perfectly logical response. Yet, such introspection is too complex for people like him. Why bother searching for problems within oneself? Strangely enough, it was Zanel who interrupted the silence. She tried to take her lover by the elbow to lead him out, but Kofi had no intention of leaving as he had not finished speaking. "Are you sure that I'm not entitled to anything at all? A mandatory share or whatever it's called? I am the husband after all," the man shrieked. Even Zanel winced at such behavior, let alone the others present. Only the elderly notary, accustomed to such conduct, remained unsurprised. According to the will, you are not included in the circle of persons entitled to a mandatory share in the inheritance. Moreover, I carefully studied your marriage contract. Its text is attached here." The notary patted the thick folder in front of him with his hand, "And you have no chance, even when appealing to the courts, although you naturally retain the right to such an appeal. Of course I will dispute it. It's unclear who this illegitimate child really is, who she claimed as her son." Kofi went on a rampage and didn't realize what he was saying. Kwame struggled to restrain himself from punching the arrogant man. Even the usually calm Mr. Abiodun flushed in anger. Only the notary remained as calm as a python. For him, this was a typical workday, and nothing was surprising. He calmly responded, "Attached here are not only the child's birth certificate but also medical documents providing clear answers about his birth. Furthermore, as per the deceased's request, there is a DNA examination result confirming that your wife is the biological mother of Jabari Akoto. I should inform you that all documents have been gathered completely and thoroughly. Can I see?" Kofi wanted to see the evidence. "No, you can only review the part that pertains to you. All other documents, especially those regarding the child, can only be disclosed with the parent's consent." "Of course, I do not permit it," Kwame immediately interjected. "So it's possible only in a court proceeding if the court deems it necessary to demand these documents," the notary clarified. This was the final straw for Kofi. He stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him, vowing not to let this matter rest. His mistress, however, was more polite. She said goodbye and left quietly, closing the door behind her. "Does it matter that he didn't sign that the will was read to him?" Mr. Abiodun asked the notary. "There are many like him. It's nothing more than a formality," the notary reassured him. "It would be funny if it weren't so sad." "I still don't understand how Aminata got involved with him," Mr. Abiodun said, his thoughts aloud, but his question remained rhetorical. The men quickly signed the necessary documents and shook hands. Mr. Abiodun helped Kwame put little Jabari into the stroller. "Will you join us? I want to take a walk, get some fresh air, and it's good for the baby," Kwame asked. "Certainly, I'll join for a while," Mr. Abiodun agreed. They walked in silence, listening to the rustle of the stroller wheels. "Do you think Aminata would be satisfied with how I'm coping?" Kwame finally asked, voicing what had been bothering him. "I'm sure of it. You're a wonderful father, and it's clear to see how much you both mean to each other," Aminata's godfather reassured him. "To be honest, there's one thing I can't get out of my head. You know, I think Aminata told you that I advised her against what just happened at the notary's office," Kwame admitted. "Are you talking about this circus with the will, and how Kofi found out about Jabari, Mr.?" Abiodun nodded in response. "Of course," Kwame replied. "I was the one who constantly brought up the conversation about that. I didn't like this idea from the very beginning. He's a nasty type, angry, stupid, and mercenary. Why provoke him? Honestly, I even contemplated telling him when the baby was already born, but Aminata was hiding it so much. I believed I had no right to. I decided that she just didn't want to deal with him herself and left these disputes to us. Today I saw him with that woman, showing no shame at all. Now I question whether I did the right thing by not insisting on my stance." His reaction. The expression on his face, it was horrifying. "It would have been better to get rid of him earlier," Kwame said, regretfully. "I think Aminata didn't want to either. That played a part too. And revenge. She wanted revenge because she loved. Regardless of what she said later, she loved intensely, and this corrupted love found no other way out. My poor girl," the elderly man said, wiping a tear trickling down his cheek. "Don't grieve for her. She asked us not to. She asked us to direct all our love, which was for her, to Jabari." Kwame comforted Aminata's godfather. While the two men reminisced, Kofi and Zanel sat in their car discussing the same topic. "So, you won't get anything at all, right?" the girl asked in disbelief, blinking rapidly. "You're such a fool. You heard that there are no chances because of this foundling." "Okay, let's go. We need to take at least something valuable and move it to my apartment," she said. 3 days later, Kwame finally mustered the courage to visit Aminata's house, only to find it empty. He had braced himself for a confrontation and even brought 2 security guards for his protection, but Kofi had already left, taking with him plenty of valuables. Now Kofi was sitting alone in the small kitchen of his tiny apartment, nursing a bit of whiskey. Zanel had left him, which was quite expected. Why would she need a beggar man? As Kofi pondered his current situation, he couldn't help but reflect on how he had ended up here. Before, women used to pay him to be with them, but now he needed to offer money to a young, beautiful girl just to stay in her company. Ironically, Kofi, a gigolo past his prime and deteriorated due to his vices, didn't blame himself for his circumstances. In his thoughts, his wife was the villain who had drained his vitality and dashed his hopes, leaving him without inheritance. He had been so looking forward to the money. In his fantasies, he was young, handsome, successful, and extremely wealthy. But as a parting shot, Zanel had told him some harsh truths. No one needed him, he was just a poor drunkard living in delusions of grandeur. It was very difficult to come to terms with that reality. His dreams of wealth and success, largely contingent on his ex-wife, crumbled like a house of cards. His aspirations to be a successful businessman were dashed. Blinded by his ego, he failed to see his own part in his downfall. Instead, he blamed his deceased wife, whom he saw as the root of all his problems. Kofi spent nearly 2 weeks in a drunken stupor, seeking escape from reality, and his resentment grew stronger each day. During one bleak, hangover-filled morning, he decided he had had enough. Enough. He realized that he wouldn't achieve success or revenge on Aminata by drinking. Kofi felt deeply humiliated. A few days prior, men from Mr. Abiodun had arrived and practically forced him to hand over his car keys, tearing up the power of attorney Aminata had given him. Didn't you know? The power of attorney loses its legal force after the death of the person who issued it, one of the men had said in a derogatory manner. In his mind, Kofi saw himself as a saint who never left his sick wife's side. He conveniently overlooked his endless intrigues, gambling, alcohol abuse, and dismissive behavior toward his wife. What a pity that she's dead and I can't hit her, he thought. So many times he barely restrained his impulse, encouraging himself that his patience would be generously rewarded. He began to ponder how he would like to take revenge on her and what he should do now. At first he wanted to desecrate her grave, but then, contemplating what was dear to Aminata and what harm would cause her the most suffering, he saw another answer, which was lying on the surface: Jabari. Kofi was literally struck by electricity when this idea came to his head. He laughed viciously, having finally devised his revenge plan. Of course, there were many issues to resolve and structure, but he had decided on the main thing: he was not going to hurt Jabari. What's a mother's worst nightmare? Not being able to help her child in trouble. That's precisely what he decided to do. The plan of his inflamed imagination was simple: to kidnap the baby, take him far away, and leave him at an orphanage. After a week, thoughts of revenge and fantasies of it warmed Kofi's soul, if he had one, of course. He hadn't smiled like this for a long time. True, such a grimace looked rather intimidating and scary, but Aminata's husband didn't care at all. You could even say that he was happy. As he thought through all the details, he experienced euphoria. The object of his hatred was not nearby, but Kofi eagerly imagined how Aminata would have suffered from her inability to help her child. Once he had settled on a plan theoretically, he began to think about the practical side. He needed to find out everything about Jabari's movements and those with whom he left the house to perfectly select the place and time for his crime. Kofi had known Kwame well in the past and was even familiar with his parents, having visited their house. He also knew that their elite suburban settlement had enhanced security. As Kofi began to contemplate his plan, he realized the challenges he would face. He couldn't predict how much time he would spend observing from the forest with binoculars, studying the child's daily routine and movements. Is the gain worth the candle? He thought. Absolutely. Kofi reasoned with himself. His mental state had been noticeably affected after the announcement of the will. She ruined my life, and I will ruin the life of her child. A rich heir. He will live off the state's readiness, and his mother will watch from the other world, realizing she is to blame for everything. The man laughed maliciously. If an indifferent person had been near Kofi at that moment, they would have noticed the drastic changes in his mind and taken him to a doctor. Unfortunately, history doesn't entertain hypotheticals. Kofi was unmatched in achieving his goals. If he had a plan, no matter how foolish it seemed, he saw it through to the end. He spent 2 full days not watching but preparing the necessary conditions for it. Kofi scouted the entire territory to find the perfect vantage point. He needed a spot that overlooked the entire settlement, especially the Ikoto house, while remaining hidden. The man devoted all his effort and time to finding a place that he deemed perfect in every aspect. For over a week, Kofi rose at dawn and hurried to the cottage settlement, remaining there until late evening. He kept a constant watch with binoculars, recording every activity in the house, who arrived and when they departed. He diligently maintained a notebook to ensure he didn't miss anything. He found that the child was cared for by Kwame, his grandmother, and the nanny. Of course, Kwame and his mother were unsuitable for implementing Kofi's plans. They both knew him well and could identify him immediately. Kofi had no intention of being punished for the crime he had committed. Of course, he anticipated that the police would come to him with questions, but he hoped to wave them away. Therefore, the nanny was chosen as the victim of the attack in Kofi's plan. She had a fixed schedule, and she always walked with Jabari in the same locations, along the same routes. Fortune favored Kofi on Wednesday during her daytime walk with the peacefully sleeping baby. The nanny left the secured territory of the settlement. She followed a small forest path to a clearing where another nanny from a nearby settlement met her. They conversed, and Kofi even heard their laughter. The man decided to stop watching the settlement daily to avoid attracting attention. He needed to remain inconspicuous. Now he only visited on Wednesdays, trying to coincide with the nanny's daytime walk. Everything was precise, like clockwork. Each Wednesday, the nanny would leave the safety of the settlement and walk the forest path. For 4 consecutive Wednesdays, he observed the system to ensure it did not fail. On the 4th Wednesday, he knew he would return the next week at the same time to take away the child. To execute his plan, he purchased a powerful stun gun from a local market, paying cash to avoid being traced. He meticulously planned every detail to avoid capture. Similarly, he brought an old car, stole license plates, and attached them to the vehicle. He strategically determined where to park the car so it was close enough to escape but not so near as to attract attention. He also considered his appearance, taking steps to disguise his figure and face to avoid recognition. Thoughts of kidnapping consumed him. He went to sleep and woke up with these thoughts, even dreaming about the act in precise detail. As the appointed day approached, he lost nearly 7 kilos and became a mere shadow of his former self. A quick glance at him was enough to realize this was a man to be feared. Traces of neurosis and obsession began to etch themselves onto his face. On Wednesday, he parked in a pre-selected spot and waited. As he saw the nanny pushing the stroller down the path, he trembled. The extensive planning had disconnected him from the reality of his impending actions. He was about to confront a stranger, assault her with a stun gun, snatch the child from the stroller, and flee to his car. Kofi had imagined the situation to be different, more like a scene from a video game. Here, however, everything was real: the woman, the baby in the stroller, and the baby examining his surroundings with curiosity. By nature, Kofi was not violent, and crossing that line was difficult for him. But his deep-seated hatred for Aminata drove him to carry out his plan. He approached the boy's nanny, pushed her away from the stroller, and knocked her down. He then used a taser on her, and she passed out from the shock. All that was left was to take the child out of the stroller and run to the car. However, things went awry at this point. He bent down to unfasten the belts. Suddenly, he felt a blow to his head and fell to the ground. The next thing he knew, an elderly man was standing over him. He was scolding Kofi and tying his hands. Kofi lost consciousness again. The mysterious man turned out to be a gamekeeper who was well known in 2 nearby elite communities. His guardhouse was practically in the middle, just beyond a clearing where nannies from the neighboring settlements often gathered. His dwelling was concealed behind dense greenery and went unnoticed by Kofi. That day, Mr. Memtembu had been returning from the local store when he noticed suspicious activity. He later explained to the police officer, "I saw someone standing guard, dressed entirely in black, despite the morning heat. I decided to watch a little and investigate. Due to his many years as a gamekeeper, Mr. Mtembu was adept at moving silently through the forest to avoid alarming the wildlife. I hid behind a tree and kept a watchful eye." Suddenly, I saw a man attack a woman, knocking her down. I initially thought that he intended to assault her, but he was trying to reach the child. I rushed over and hit him with a stick I had picked up just in case, Mr. Membu explained. Good job, Mr. Mtembu. You've become a local hero. Look, the press is already gathering. They want to interview you. Sign this police report and bask in your newfound fame, said one of the officers. No, I won't go to them. I don't care for that sort of thing, replied the gamekeeper and quietly walked back to his place in a roundabout way so that no one would follow. Mr. Mtembu didn't feel he had done anything extraordinary. He believed anyone would have acted similarly in his position. How could he not assist when those who couldn't defend themselves were in danger? A few hours later, Kwame appeared at Mr. Membu's house. Hello, I am the father of the boy you rescued today. He's a good kid. He calmed down as soon as I picked him up, such a brave and intelligent-looking boy. Thank you so much. It's a blessing you were there at the time. We're so grateful you didn't just pass by, Kwame said, on the verge of tears, overwhelmed with emotions. The day had been incredibly intense, leaving him emotionally shaken. Tell me, how can I thank you? What are you talking about? There's no need to thank me. Who keeps score when a child's life hangs in the balance? Mr. Mtembu was genuinely surprised to be thanked for his actions. Nevertheless, Kwame persisted. Well, if you insist, a new hunting suit and maybe some food for my dog would be appreciated. Of course, no problem. By the way, if you don't mind me asking, was all this done for money? Asked a curious gamekeeper. Oh, sadly, it's much more complicated than that, replied Kwame. Well, feel free to share if it's not too much trouble. I live somewhat isolated here, in an information vacuum, so to speak, Mr. Mtembu admitted. Kwame began to recount the disjointed events of the past years, including Aminata's illness, their unconventional parenting decision, her subsequent death, and the ensuing revenge against her husband. The investigator informed me that Kofi was deeply hurt, as everyone assumed his actions were solely driven by greed. He was, in fact, consumed by revenge, Kwame explained. Kwame was relieved that Mr. Mtembu had inquired about this complex story. He had been eager to share it with someone, seeking an unbiased perspective from an outsider. He questioned if they had driven Kofi into a state of madness and revenge. If it were just about himself, Kwame wouldn't suffer so much reflexivity, but everything he and Aminata did went back to their boy. After concluding his story, Kwame turned to Mr. Membu, an impartial observer, and asked, Do you think we pushed him to this point? Are we responsible for his entire desire for revenge? Oh boy, are you serious? You're an adult and you're talking such nonsense. That Kofi of yours always found a reason he doesn't even need one. He married for money, cheated shamelessly, mistreated his sick wife, and convinced himself it was all her fault. What's her fault? Retaliating once? Losing patience? Not enduring it? Oh, she hit the most painful thing for him, the wallet. On the contrary, well done. The woman has thought up such a plan and put it into practice. This harsh truth from a strange man's perspective truly uplifted Kwame. He deeply pondered every word Mr. Mtembu had said. Now I also owe you for your good advice, Kwame smiled in response. The gamekeeper merely waved his hand at him. They parted as friends. And Mr. Mtembu promised to check in on the boy. I heard somewhere that the Chinese have this belief or wisdom, God knows what to call it, that if you save someone's life, you're responsible for that person forever. So, don't worry about your Jabari. I'll look after him here too, the gamekeeper said as a farewell. True to his word, he regularly visited Kwame's house and was always a welcome guest. In him, the boy found another loving family member. The court sentenced Kofi to several years of imprisonment. During this lengthy period, everyone in the house managed to calm down and return to their usual quiet life. The family could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Mr. Abiodun regularly visited and babysat the boy, diligently fulfilling the duties assigned to him by his goddaughter. Kwame met a single mom whose daughter attends the same kindergarten group as Jabari. The children got along well, and Kwame's parents hoped that this time their son's personal life would flourish, and Jabari would have a loving stepmother and sister, perhaps even more than one sister. But of course, as Kwame promised Aminata, he would never allow Jabari to forget his own mother. He always talked about her, showing the boy pictures and videos. He constantly reminded him that his mother loves him very much, and she is always with him, protecting and watching over him, even if he can't see her.